I thought we'd talk about an interesting passage today. I've heard this discussed a lot in my life, and I thought this might be interesting to y'all, not only because of the issue it raises, but also it's something very important to keep in mind when we read the Bible. And we've talked about this danger in the Bible before, but I wanted to point it out again because I think it is so vital to understand. Now the passage is what we heard as our gospel reading. That came from Matthew 29. And Jesus said, "Are not two sparrows sold for a farthing? And yet one of them shall not fall to the ground without your Father." Now that's from the King James Version. And the problem comes in with that phrase, "and yet not one of them shall fall to the ground without your Father." Now what does that mean, without your Father? It's obvious there that Jesus referred to God as our Father, that he's talking about God. But without God, what? Does it mean that God falls with the sparrow to the ground? And that doesn't make sense. Actually, when you read that, "and yet not one of them shall fall to the ground without your Father," it sounds like there's been a word left out there. So, what is that word that is left out, if there is one? Does it mean without your Father knowing it, caring about it, allowing it, causing it, or what? Now, we're going to clear this up, and a lot of times, if, a lot of people, they have multiple translations of the Bible. Like they might have the King James, New International, New Revised Standard, and several of them. So if you do that, and you say, "Well, I'll just go to another Bible version and look it up." So I go to the New King James Version. Here's what it says. "And yet not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will." Well, that's different than the King James. King James just said, "without your Father." This says, "apart from your Father's will." And so this is telling you that if a sparrow falls to the ground, God willed it to happen. God caused it to happen, in other words. Or if he didn't cause it, he at least allowed it. So God either caused or allowed it, according to the New King James. Now I go over and I get the New International Version down. And it said, "Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care." And that's different. And this one indicates that God cares if the sparrow falls to the ground. Now, according to the New King James, God either caused it or allowed it. But according to the New International, God cares. So I want to go get another one. I'll get the New Living Translation. And it says, "But not a single sparrow can fall to the ground without your Father knowing it." All right, that's another different one. Unlike the King James, which said God either caused it or allowed it, or the New International Version, which says that God cares about it, this one says that God knows about it. So God knows it if a sparrow falls. So I don't like that one necessarily, so I'll go and I'll pull another one off the shelf. The International Standard Version. And it says this, "Yet not one of them will fall to the ground without your Father's permission." And this is getting a little like the New King James, but the New King James said without your Father's will, which could either indicate God caused it or allowed it. This one is just saying God allowed it. God didn't cause it. They backed out of the God causing it and just saying God only allows it. And then, since all of us are living in the contemporary Christian era, we'll go get the Message. That's what they use today. And this is what that says. "God cares what happens to it even more than you do." I couldn't help but laugh at that one. So this indicates that God cares, and he cares a lot more than you do when one of those sparrows fall out of the ground. So, we've looked at 6 different Bible translations. Every one of them's got something different. And yet, the King James just said, "without your Father." One told us that if a sparrow falls to the ground, it's God's will. One told us God cares about it. One told us that God permits it. And one says that God cares about it, and He cares a lot more than we do. So which one of these do we choose? You see, it makes a big difference because all those are different. And it makes a big difference, obviously, because this idea that Jesus is talking about is going to carry over into our lives. Is Jesus telling us that God causes the bad things in our lives? Is He telling us that God doesn't cause them but permits them? Is He telling us that God knows about them? Is He telling us that God cares about it? Or is He telling us that God cares about it more than anybody else does? There's a big difference between those. They are not the same thing. None of them are. If something bad happens in your life, it will make a big difference to you. Whether God caused it, allowed it, cares about it, or knows about it, or something else. So, what was Jesus trying to say? We obviously can't get an answer going to these different Bible translations because these are not really translations, are they? There's somebody telling us what they think the Bible means. So we'll go to the Greek manuscript. It says this: not one of them shall fall on the ground without your Father. That's all it says. Not one of them shall fall on the ground without your Father. That's what the King James Version had. Where did the other ones get what they had? They're supposed to be translations, but yet in the Greek manuscripts they supposedly translated from, none of those words they put in there were in there. They made it up because that's what they thought Jesus meant. In other words, when you read any of those Bible versions, you're not getting what the Bible says. You're getting what somebody's telling you they think it means, and they are cloaking it and deceiving you by telling you the Bible said that when it did not. It's evil. It's evil. Remember, in the Bible, deception in any form is always associated with evil. Now, the Greek leaves it hanging. Without your Father is all it says. The thought is not completed. We have to try to interpret to complete the thought. Not one of them falls on the ground without your Father. Without your Father. Now, when we're looking at something in the Bible that we don't understand, the first thing we need to do is find out what it really says. And, every Bible translation is an interpretation, including the King James. And so you can go to several, and I can go to the Greek. That was the first class I ever had in seminary. It lasted a summer, and I was scared to death I'd fail it. But it was the thing that I used most. So you go and you say, it just says, without your Father. The next thing you do when you're trying to figure out what something the Bible says is look at the context. That is, look at what comes before it and look at what comes after it. In the context of this verse, it is in a long speech that Jesus is giving to His disciples. He is going to send them out to proclaim the kingdom of heaven is at hand, to heal the sick, and to cast out demons, and to raise the dead. We know that because that's what Jesus says in the verses preceding that. But then He cautions them. He says, you must be as sheep among wolves. He tells them they will be persecuted, they will be hated, and then He says, but don't let that bother you. When that happens, they are simply to move on. Jesus says, leave that place, and when you leave, shake the dust of it off of your feet. He even goes on to tell them that you may be killed. But He says, do not fear those who can kill the body. And that is, don't fear people. Don't fear what people can do to you. But Jesus says, rather fear him who is able to destroy both body and soul in Gehenna. In other words, fear God. And then right after that, he says that about the sparrows. And then a little after that, Jesus said, he who finds his life will lose it. He who loses his life for my sake will find it. So that's the context of what we're talking about today, about the sparrow falling. Jesus is sending the disciples out. He's saying you're not going to be well received, you're going to be hated, you're going to be persecuted, you're going to be rejected, and you may even be killed. But he then tells them not to be concerned if they lose their lives. Now we can use this context to try to help us determine what the verse with the sparrow in it means. The way we do that, we look at the different Bible translations and we put what they said into the context and see if it makes sense. So I want to start with the one that says, and yet not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will. The one said, your Father's permission. Neither one of those fit with the context, because nowhere in what comes before or after it, remember, Jesus is telling the disciples, I'm sending you out. People are going to hate you. They're going to persecute you. They're going to reject you. They may even kill you. Nowhere does Jesus hint in there that any of that is God's will. Nowhere does Jesus hint in there that God has given permission for this to happen. So none of that fits the context. One of the translations we saw said, yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. And that doesn't fit with what Jesus is saying either. Because he's saying, I'm sending you out, people are going to reject you, persecute you, maybe even kill you. But he doesn't say, but God cares. God cares. Oh, you sat down and cried, and God will put his arm around your shoulder and just hug you. That's not what Jesus is saying. So that doesn't fit with the context. Then another one said, yet not one single sparrow can fall to the ground without your Father knowing it. Again, that doesn't fit with the context. Because in what Jesus said before and after, he's not talking about, I'm going to send you out as sheep among wolves. They're going to persecute you, reject you, maybe even kill you. But don't worry, because God knows. God knows. He doesn't say that. So see, none of those fit with the context. None of them do. You know, if you say that it means any of those things we've talked about, then what you're saying is that Jesus was talking about this, then all of a sudden he said one sentence about this on a completely different subject, and then started back with what he was talking about. Now, although that is possible, he could have done that, that's not the most logical and reasonable thing to think that he would have done. The most logical and reasonable thing to think is that this passage is a complete thought, and it's all connected. Not that Jesus is talking about grapes over here, then he says one sentence about the price of gas, and then starts talking about grapes again. You can say that he's talking about grapes through the whole passage, in other words. So, with this context we've seen, what would it mean when Jesus says, and not one of them shall fall on the ground without your Father? What thought comes after your Father? I want to consider two clues to that. Earlier in verse 28, Jesus had said, do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. In other words, Jesus said, don't fear people. All they can do is kill the body. Fear God who can kill body and soul. And then later in verse 29, Jesus said, he who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it. So if we put those two together, it's not unreasonable to come up with an idea like this. Maybe Jesus was saying, I'm sending you out. You're going to be persecuted. You're going to be hated. You're going to be rejected. And you may even be killed. But even if you are, all they can do is kill the body. If you lose your Life for my sake you will find. Even for the sparrow that falls to the ground, God has the ability beyond that to make it okay. Even for the sparrow who falls to the ground, it's not the end. Even when the sparrow falls to the ground, God is still able to work. And so maybe look at it like when something bad happens in your life, you look at this passage. Some would tell you it means that God caused it. Some would tell you it means that God permitted it. Some would tell you that it means that God cares. Some would tell you it means that God knows about it. If something bad happens in your life and you think God caused it, how would that make you feel about God? If something bad happened in your life and you thought God allowed it, how would that make you feel about God? If something bad happened in your life and you thought God cares about it, what difference would that make? If God doesn't do anything but cry with you, what difference would that make? If something bad happens in your life and you think, well, God knows about it, again, if God doesn't do anything, how would that be any help to you knowing that God knows about it? So what if he knows about it? He ain't going to do anything. So what? It wouldn't matter. It would make no difference. So we either have a God pictured here that is got fangs on him, sending bad things on your life, or permitting bad things, or we have a God that knows and cares but doesn't do anything. Do you like that God? If you ask me what I thought this passage means, here's what I would tell you. I would tell you that I think it means that even if the worst happens, God is still able to make it okay. This bad thing has happened in my life. I know God didn't cause it. I know God didn't allow it. And it's not that God just cares or just knows. It's God is working against it right now. And he won't quit working against it until whatever it is has been undone. And one day, even though it may be on the other side of this life, it will be undone and God will reverse it. God didn't just care about it, didn't just know about it, and certainly didn't cause it or allow it. It happened, and God is working right now to reverse it. And I know that one day in the future, even if it is beyond this life, it will be reversed. Notice, it will be reversed. It will be reversed. If I had to tell someone a summary of what I believe the Christian faith is about, that would be it.